Today is the 28th of July, 2016. The title is Reagan's Secretary of State, Alexander Haig's Intervention in the Fifth Israeli War against the PLO. And my guest is Jeff Risner, who sits on the Athens City Council as a Democrat. And I am Robert Whaley, retired historian from Ohio University. And this is Athens Speakout number 340. Now, I can begin with a kind of a statement and review that Ronald Reagan won a tremendous victory in 1980 and had a fixed perception of the Soviet Union. And Ronald Reagan's campaign, beginning in the primary in February of 1980, going through November, was rather simplistic. He simply smashed Jimmy Carter by campaigning for the opening of a second Cold War, and he was against Carter's appeasement. Of course, that had nothing to do with reality, but that's what Reagan campaigned on, and the mass media bought the term Cold War hook, line, and sinker. The term Cold War was not an outright lie, but the concept was not deliberate propaganda either. The concept goes way back to 1947, and it is only a metaphor expressing the situation in 1947, and it was composed by Walter Lippmann, a famous #1 journalist in the United States, who wrote for the New York Herald Tribune, now a defunct paper. But what Walter Lippmann said was, in May of 1947, is that the United States is neither in peace nor war. We're living in a kind of a twilight zone, which we might call the Cold War. We have to change the preaching against anti-fascism and start a campaign against anti-communism. And it doesn't make any difference whether Truman or Dewey wins this 1948 election. When the election is over, we're going to have a Cold War against the Soviet Union. And that cliche became propagated by newspapers and television again and again and again. And Ronald Reagan picked it up from J. Edgar Hoover, and then he tried to infiltrate the Screen Actors Guild and was always talking about the Cold War, and it was really left unchanged in Reagan's mind up until 1980. And it had very little to do with the realities of the Middle East conflict, which was growing. And I don't think Ronald Reagan understood why it was growing. But in any case, Cold War meant, in ordinary language, an anti-communist attitude. And the West Germans assumed that there was a Cold War, and Walter Lippmann assumed that Stalin had a plan in 1948 to invade West Germany. Stalin had no such plan. Stalin had a very weak military. And it was a creation of unnecessary fear, and it led to a nuclear arms race. And Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy, all the subsequent presidents, kind of confused the Cold War with a shooting war and with the arms race. Anyway, there was a little dust up in Berlin in 1948, and Stalin did try a bit of coercion by imposing a railroad blockade against the West German zone of Britain and the United States to supply Berlin. And he thought that the United States could never supply Berlin, this little island, this zone of the British zone, the French zone, the American zone. But Ronald Reagan, Stalin was fooled, because Lucius Clay stood his ground and said, we're going to supply Berlin for a year with C-47s. We're going to ship coal to Berlin. And this was called the Berlin Blockade and the Berlin Airlift. And by April of 1949, Stalin knew that he had lost this gamble, because America, France, Britain, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and 12 democracies said, all right, we'll form an alliance directed against the Soviet Union. And that is called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the most advanced and successful defensive alliance in the history of the world. And Stalin knew that he would be on the defensive from that point forward. Nevertheless, the military-industrial complex in the United States kept pretending Soviets started the Cold War, they're ahead, they're going to attack, and so forth and so on. And a lot of naive people believed that great fear. Now, Marshal Tito threw a monkey wrench into this. Marshal Tito was the communist in an independent Yugoslavia, and in 1948, he began to have doubts about Stalin's brand of communism, and he declared a new neutral position, neither joining NATO nor joining Stalin's Warsaw Treaty Organization, and having an independent socialist Yugoslav republic. And he created what was now called, or what was then called, the non-alignment movement. And he allied Yugoslavia with Egypt and with Indonesia and various third world countries that did not want any World War III and would like to keep the United States and the Soviet Union out of the arms race. Well, that leads to eventually the breakup of Yugoslavia under Clinton, and it is now broken up into 8 nations. It was an American intervention by the Clinton administration, which weakens Yugoslavia, weakens communism or socialism in Yugoslavia. But we now have 8 nations, Serbs, Croats, and so forth and so on, and the Serbs are now independent, but kind of tilting toward Russia on grounds of orthodoxy. And the United States has created new enemies by its propaganda of intervening in countries that it can't control. And that was the problem of Ronald Reagan in 1988 when he allied with Texas oil companies and with his vice president, George Bush, and we had a very powerful Republican administration. Reagan and California controlled the media, and Texas and the Vice President Bush controlled the oil, and the Democrats were labeled as appeasers, and Jimmy Carter attempt at peace in the Middle East came to naught. Meanwhile, we have the neoconservatives, which began in 1967 in Israel's third war. And the neoconservatives are conservative Jewish Zionists in America who align themselves with the Republicans and the arms producers, and about 20% of the Jews are aligned to bankers in Wall Street, profiteers, and 70 or 80% of the Jews still vote for the Democrats on idealistic basis that the Democrats will help preserve the independence of Israel. So George Bush and the CIA from 1988 and 1992 were getting involved deeper and deeper into the Middle East problem as the Soviet Union was declining economically and militarily, and as Stalin's successors could no longer keep up with the arms race. So the second statement I would like to make is about this nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. After building so many nuclear arms, both sides decided that we've reached overkill. We have to have a nuclear disarmament arms agreement treaties in order to save the world. And John Kennedy, in August of 1963, took the first step toward nuclear disarmament by concluding the Nuclear Atmosphere Test Ban Treaty. And China and France did not sign it, but it was a three-power agreement between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union to only test underground, stop the radioactivity radioactive strontium-90 in poisoning the world. The second step was taken surprisingly by Richard Nixon, who in 1972 signed in May of 72 the ABM Treaty, which the United States and the Soviet Union agreed not to expand anti-ballistic missiles launch systems, and each side would be limited to one. And that helped Nixon and Kissinger have a new balance of power, get out of Vietnam, and kind of pit People's Republic of China against the Soviet Union. So then, but now, nobody wanted to talk about Israel, a fifth nuclear power, who secretly built a nuclear plant in Dimona, called Dimona Plant, in the Negev Desert, and they didn't sign any nuclear disarmament treaties. They were going to be alone and save Israel by having a second strike capability. Well, that is the illusion of the Israeli armed forces. Anyway, President Kennedy, President Johnson, President Nixon, Ford, the fourth president, and Jimmy Carter all had United Nations intervention in order to cover up the Israeli rather aggressive government. And Ronald Reagan then came to power with the Jewish Israeli lobby having tremendous power. And these earlier presidents always paid anything that Israel asked for arms, $3 billion a year. Sometimes it went up to $6 billion. And Ronald Reagan then, and his new administration, would provide Israel with as many arms as they might need. Anyway, I think that's enough on the nuclear arms standoff. Let's have our first question to our guest. Can you characterize the three Soviet leaders who faced Ronald Reagan in his early years from 1981 to 85? Do you know anything about them?
Well, yeah, a little bit. The first one that he had to deal with was Leonid Brezhnev.
Yeah.
Brezhnev succeeded Nikita Khrushchev in 1964.
That's very good.
Brezhnev was one of those Soviet leaders that came from dirt poor background, right. Absolutely, impoverished.
Right.
Survived the initial, 1917 revolution.
Right.
In fact, he was I believe he was a soldier at one point in the Imperial.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Russian army. but most of them were. I mean, they were, and he became, and his successors like Yuri Andropov and
Chernenko,
yeah,
we're all three stale bureaucrats.
Well, yeah, they all pretty much come from the same background, just like Khrushchev did. Khrushchev came from a pig farm.
Right.
Stalin came from a seminary in Georgia, but so they had poor backgrounds, but they did receive education, and they became the middle functionaries of the party. You know, they were in the commissariat bureau. They were on the political wing of the Russian army during the Great Patriotic War, you know, 1940 through 45 against the Germans.
That's very good.
So Brezhnev became more or less a protege of Khrushchev during the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was the political commissar in charge of the political morale of the Soviet army fighting the Germans in Stalingrad and on the Stalingrad front against von Manstein.
Well, Stalin was actually in command of everything.
Well, yeah,
he ran the Politburo.
he ran
A, B, C.
Sure, but you know, day-to-day tactical operations, Stalin couldn't do anything about. You know, he had to leave that off to his commanders.
Right.
And initially in 42, the battle for Stalingrad, that initial whole invasion of southern Russia through the Crimea all the way down to the Caspian went horribly wrong for the Russians.
In the beginning.
In the beginning. Well, you know, if you go back, when the Russians stopped the initial Soviet or the German push towards Moscow in December of 1940, they were able to...
Wait, 41.
41, that's right, 41.
Hitler invaded in 41.
That's right, 41.
And he won a tremendous offensive right up to Christmas, right up to
He
December.
did, absolutely, yeah.
And they got up to the gates of Leningrad and stopped. They got up to the gates of Moscow and stopped.
Yes.
And then they got deep into the Ukraine. They didn't get all the way to Stalingrad.
No,
but then the winter came.
They weren't going in southern Ukraine at that time.
Right.
The whole offensive was take Moscow.
Right.
Unfortunately, for the Germans, they overlooked a couple of things. One, they got off to a
slow start.
No, not slow start. Back up.
Okay.
Okay. Mussolini in 1941 was very jealous that Hitler was getting all the glory and he wasn't getting anything.
Right.
So he launched a horrible, horrible invasion of Yugoslavia.
Right.
Okay, we're back to Yugoslavia
and
Greece and Albania, and he got the living hell kicked out of him.
Right.
Well, here is the German army preparing for Operation Barbarossa, this huge, huge, gigantic invasion of the Soviet Union. You know, 3 million men, the largest land army ever amassed, ready to go. And they're ready to go, not in August 1941, but they were ready to go in June. They wanted to go early.
Right.
Okay? Because everybody knows you don't want to fight the winter.
Right.
Well, Mussolini tripped up the timetable. Now Hitler had to bail him out. So he had to ship troops out of this operation south into the Balkans, where nobody in their right mind wants to fight.
Right.
And now they're delayed. Now, of course, the German army crushed the Yugoslavs and the Greeks and the Albanians. They got in there, they got out, they drove the British out of Crete. They drove them all the way back to Egypt.
Right.
But that drew troops away from the big operation.
You got it.
So anyway, now they're delayed by 6 weeks. Well, that 6 weeks was absolutely, positively critical.
All right.
So they got forced out. Okay, well, anyway, back into, with Brezhnev and at Stalingrad, Brezhnev was the underboss of Khrushchev, who was busy boosting morale, which basically meant...
You say both Khrushchev and Brezhnev were in Stalingrad physically.
Yes, physically, yeah.
And Stalin was off in Moscow.
He's in Moscow.
Yeah, right.
He's got more sense than
well,
Khrushchev.
I didn't know any of that. That's all news.
Oh, yeah. No.
They were fighting for their life.
Well, they still had telephones and radio. They could communicate that way. But that's where Brezhnev more or less made his bones. That's where Khrushchev would give an order and it would get carried out.
Right.
And he didn't care what the cost was. But the thing that's interesting is, even though Brezhnev was in the political arm of the Russian army, he was a commissar. He was a political functionary, apparatchik. That's what his job was. He was not on the front line. He wasn't commanding troops, but he carried the rank of lieutenant colonel, colonel, general of the Red Army. So he got to wear the Red Army and so on, and he got to wear the medals, and so he was. And
well, you know something about Soviet propaganda.
Yeah, so he got shipped around a lot. So as Khrushchev rose,
he rose with
Brezhnev came with. Now, of course, Khrushchev was popular with Stalin even in the 1930s. I mean, Khrushchev survived the purges.
Yeah, but he was a lower rank.
That's right, but he was just this middle guy, who could get things. Right. But don't forget, a lot of middle rankers ended up in Siberia and were executed too.
Somewhere.
So. But anyway, that's where Brezhnev came along. But in 1981, Brezhnev, who had deposed, it was a coup. They threw Khrushchev out.
64.
64. Khrushchev had just come back from a couple of conferences in Czechoslovakia. He went to his dacha on the Black Sea and thinking everything's cool and fine. Right. Now, according to his son, who wrote a biography about him, he was just sitting around there and gets this phone call.
Right.
Hey, we're meeting here in Moscow. We need you. We're the Politburo's having a meeting. Oh, okay. And when he put down the phone call, someone, an old friend of his came and says, "Don't go. They're going to throw you out. They're going to depose you. What you need to do right now, instead of going there into the trap, you got to call up your friends, and you need to lead a counter push.
Okay.
Arrest these men. Arrest the entire Politburo right now. Right. Just get on the phone and arrest them." Khrushchev goes, "Are you kidding? They like me, we're all buddies. And besides, Brezhnev is my buddy. I made him what he is. He's nothing without me."
I didn't know that story at all.
So anyway.
What did you read? Khrushchev's memoirs?
Yes, by his son, Sergei Khrushchev.
Yeah, I've heard the book, but I've never read it.
Yeah, I read the English translation of it. It's a good book.
No doubt.
Of course, it's slanted towards Dad.
Of course.
But there we are. I mean, that's the only source we really have.
Yeah.
Though Khrushchev, according to his son, kept a whole stash of secret papers down in his dacha that even the KGB didn't know about. Okay, they never found him until long after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then Sergei brought him out of hiding.
So there's new stuff coming out.
Yeah, new stuff. So anyway,
you keep up with the reviews on.
Well, I try to. That's an interesting point.
Well,
I understand Khrushchev because I grew up with Khrushchev. Okay, that was the first Soviet premier that. Yeah, I was born under Stalin.
Right.
Okay, I went through Malenkov, and now I have, but Khrushchev is the one that I remember
When
the most.
he was deposed in 64, how old were you then?
Oh, 64, 13, I guess.
Yeah, well, you're pretty wise for your age.
Well, thanks. With all this gray hair, I must be.
Most kids at 13 are not paying any attention to Soviet history.
No. Probably not, but I thought it was kind of important during that part of the Cold War because at any moment we could annihilate one another.
Yeah.
It wouldn't take much to do it.
You're afraid of the nuclear bomb.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, absolutely.
Did you have air raid warnings out here in Ohio?
Oh, we had token ones where they would do the duck and cover. The teacher would go, "Okay, do this, do that," and there were fallout shelter signs on the courthouse.
Yeah.
Capacity 150 people. So it was kind of a joke. But anyway, Reagan deals with the.
All right, now we're jumping up 80.
Yeah, well, we're
another 20 years. Okay.
Yeah, another 20 years. But Brezhnev, by this time, he's old, he's infirmed, he's in extremely poor health. His attempt to bring the Soviet Union's economy going again has failed miserably.
Right.
They're in a horrible period of stagnation. Nothing is really moving. They have spent so much money on arms, and Afghanistan was the big sink that they just simply couldn't fill.
That was stupid for the Soviets.
Oh, it totally was. But the thing is that it was Brezhnev's idea, along with Andropov, who was head of KGB at that time. They were the ones they thought, okay, we're going to go in there, we're going to prop up this guy, and we're going to be out by Christmas or any arbitrary date. It's not going to be a big deal. Okay. Well, and of course, like we found out in Vietnam, it is a big deal. Once you get there, once you break it, you own it. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So it's hard to disentangle yourself from it.
Who's the right communist? Is this guy or that guy? There were two communists.
Which one do we shoot? I don't know. So here you have the Soviet Union in that shape, and you have Reagan coming in, and he wants to really, he built up the arm race. Reagan wants to spend much more money.
Well, he's talking big.
He's talking big.
But Reagan isn't doing anything.
So,
except talking about the Cold War.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, does Reagan really deal with Brezhnev? No, he doesn't. Brezhnev is so infirmed, he's so out of it, that I don't think I could not find any record anywhere that Brezhnev ever spoke directly with Reagan.
No need a hotline.
No,
that's out.
It was
out of the picture.
It was always with someone else.
That's right.
One of his lower functionaries. Andropov, Chernenko, Gromyko was still around. Good old Andrei Gromyko, remember him?
Well, he was
still there. Let's see.
Well, he was their English expert.
Oh yes,
he knew the English language.
Oh, he absolutely did.
Didn't know it.
There is a story that when Gromyko was ambassador to the United Nations, he was going to deliver his speech before the General Assembly, and by tradition he's supposed to deliver it in his own language, and then a translator will translate, simultaneous translation. Well, there was a snafu. The translator wasn't there, or the microphones weren't working, and his, you got to get this speech done or it's canceled. And they said he went up there, just took his notes in Russian, and spoke absolutely flawless Oxford accented English.
That's right.
Just like that.
Well, he even had American English.
Oh yeah, he was just.
In fact, I read the story of how Gromyko learned English.
How did he?
It was back in 1946, when 45. Mm-hmm. When Roosevelt died. Mm-hmm. And Roosevelt died, and then Truman comes in. And Truman goes to Potsdam, and they say, we got to start over again with America. We no longer have friends, okay. Truman cut off Lend-Lease.
Yeah.
So he picks this guy who was Gromyko, knew the language, knew the science. Mm-hmm. He said, Stalin said, you go to America, and what you do is go to all the churches and sit down there and listen to American English, and you'll learn how to speak American English. And he stayed there 45, 46, 47, and then as the United Nations started debating about Korea, Gromyko gets advanced.
That's amazing. Wow, talk about immersion of a language.
I don't know where he picked up the Oxford accent, but I knew he had an American accent.
Yeah, but
from that story.
Yeah. So that's who Reagan had to deal with first. Well, poor old Brezhnev was on the verge of death anyway.
Right. Yeah, he died. He died in. I got the date here. Let's see. He died in 1982.
Right. Well, he was.
And Reagan was just in office. So
yep.
That was the end of that. And
so
then Yuri Andropov
comes in. Now Yuri again.
November of '82.
Right, and he's only there for about what 15, 16 months.
84, he dies.
Yeah, so
he dies at 69 years old.
Yeah, and his background is almost the same as Brezhnev. Again, dirt farm. He works his way up through the party structure. He's on the political side, the Politburo, and during the Great Patriotic War, he wasn't a Stalingrad. I don't know where he was in that time. His biography's a little thin, mainly because. Well,
he got into the KGB.
He got into the KGB, but he got through there not quite because he was a student of Brenna or any of those. He originally was an ambassador
to Germany,
and Czechoslovakia. He was sort of more in the political side.
Right.
But when the opening came up, I'm trying to think who his predecessor was for the KGB. He slid right in there. So, but I guess because he had the nuances and everything, maybe at that point they were thinking that KGB needs to become more concerned with politics rather than just counter-espionage and spying.
Well, there was a book put out in 1974, Will the Soviet Union Collapse by 1974, and dissent was widespread in the arms race because all of these scientists had to have American computers, and they were getting Xerox, and as they read the science, they began to look at the politics.
Yeah, yeah.
So nobody could trust anybody. And then, of course, that gets into this Polish thing, because
Right.
it's Poland that opens the door and subverts Germany and Hungary, and then they begin to eventually subvert descent into the Soviet Union.
So here we have Andropov. He goes from KGB to now he's a chair of the Communist Party, and you know.
And then he dies at
Then he
69.
At 69, and he's replaced by what's his
The
name?
third old man.
Yeah, Konstantin Chernenko.
Right.
I mean, these biographies are almost all identical.
They stay another 2 years.
But again, a similar background. Went up to the party, a political hack, and his only I don't know, key to fame was the fact that his understudy was Gorbachev. And from what I was able to understand, Chernenko, who was ill almost from the very moment, I mean, he was just hospitalized. He couldn't make any of the Politburo meetings. And so he just deputized Gorbachev, who was his deputy anyway, to be there in his stead.
Right.
So then it didn't take very long for the Politburo to realize that who's really calling the tune here is Gorbachev. Yeah, like, boy, that took a while to figure out, didn't it? Okay.
So in 85, Chernenko dies, 73 years old.
Yep.
Robert, we need to take a station break.
Okay.
Yeah, who are we and where are we at?
Well, we're finishing up the rather stale, bureaucratic Soviet Union that faced Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan didn't have to do anything about that. All he had to do was give another speech on the Cold War, and there's no firing of any action whatsoever. Now, the real change, you've just kind of hit when you say Gorbachev. But we'll postpone that for some other date. And the real new change in relationship starts in Poland.
Yes.
So I think we ought to shift over to Polish-Soviet relations.
Yeah, let's go to the
That's the key to this collapse of the Soviet bloc.
Yep.
Okay. So anyway, let's go back to 1956.
Okay.
Do you know anything about Władysław Gomulka and who he was, and how he kind of forced Khrushchev to appoint him the head of the Warsaw captive Soviet Party?
No, I'd like
You
to
don't
hear
know
this.
much about Gorbachev?
No.
About Gomulka. Well, before that, you had hardline Stalinists, and there was actually a Soviet officer in charge of the Polish army. Well, there was a kind of an opening of liberalism in 1956, because Khrushchev himself starts to talk about de-Stalinization. And this de-Stalinization theme spreads immediately to the United States, the Iron Curtain. Everybody is saying that Khrushchev is a new person. He is. So Gomulka then asks Khrushchev to appoint him the head of, as a native Pole, the head of the Communist Party instead of a Russian. Now, Khrushchev gives away because Khrushchev knows he has to be friendly to Poland more than any other Eastern European country, because he needs the railroad rights from Moscow to Berlin, and he doesn't want any hanky-panky along that railway trip. So he says, if I humor the Poles, my railroad line is safe. Okay. And the Poles are also scared of the Germans. So we're going to have a little Polish-Soviet agreement on that. So Khrushchev says, okay, Gomulka, you're in charge. And Gomulka then made some demands against the Soviet censorship, and gave some demands on Polish farmers. And he says, well, the Poles need to get foreign exchange from the Germans, and we can export beef and ham and coal to the richer West Germans.
Right.
And then we will take these dollars and we will buy half of our imports from Moscow, keep friendly with that,
Right.
and the other half from the West. So this is how Poland gets kind of economic autonomy, although Gomulka follows the party line
Right.
on a political basis, okay? So anyway, what he gets is religious autonomy.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church, freedom of religion, and as long as you stay in Krakow and in Warsaw and don't get into international affairs, it'll be okay. So then there's a second Polish Revolution in 1970, when Gomulka is old, has to step down, and there's another little working class revolution which starts in the shipyards of Gdansk, which used to be the old German city of Danzig.
Yes.
And the guy who leads that is Edward Gierek. And Edward Gierek says, okay, I want to replace Gomulka. Okay, Moscow, will you give me the job? Okay, you got the job. So he advances that 50% trade, and they're talking about a new humanistic Polish Communist Party. And the churches are getting more and more autonomy, and the trade is going on.
Now why did it happen in Gdansk?
Well, I think that was an interesting question, because there used to be a state called Prussia.
Sure.
East Prussia and West Prussia.
Yep.
And West Prussia was conquered by Frederick the Great, was an intermixed Polish-German population, okay? And there was no corridor. There was no... now, that corridor was created by the French and the Americans and the British at the time of the Versailles Treaty. And they created an independent Poland.
Right.
Well, Poland was overexpanded. They had large Jewish minorities, and there was a tradition of Polish anti-Semitic attitudes, and they had a large German minority. 99% of the people in Danzig spoke German.
Okay.
So this was Hitler's demand. He said in 1939, Poland, you either give us Danzig free of charge or we will invade.
Yep.
And that was the opening shot in World War II,
Yeah.
okay? Well, anyway, Stalin comes in there. He conquers that. And they have a division of the zones. You recall that the British and the Americans wanted a zone for the French. Stalin says, sure, you can have a zone, but you take it out of your own territory.
That's right, yeah.
And we've conquered all of this Polish, we've conquered this German population. Pomerania and Silesia are all German-speaking.
Yep.
We'll hand this over to the Polish People's Republic, and we'll put Polish commissars in charge of this. So this was a very unstable area, which there was still German spoken in those yards. Okay?
Right, sure.
So anyway, so Gierek then has a very unstable position.
Yeah, because the name Gierek is very Germanic.
Yeah, his name is Edward Gierek.
Yeah.
So that's all those Poles and Germans were mixed.
Yeah.
That's why Hitler was crazy.
Yeah.
Clausewitz was a famous German military advisor who had a Polish mother.
Yeah.
And Joseph Beck was the Polish foreign minister who had a German name, who was very anti-German. So it's the mother who determines the religion.
I see.
And it's the name goes along with the father.
Okay. So we have this revolution that starts in the shipyards.
It starts in the yard, and Gdansk is a very unstable city. Nobody, Stalin can't control it, and the Poles can't control it. And Gierek says, I want to have concessions for these shipyards. I need to have higher standard of living. We have to have economic concessions. We're importing our oil. Well, why don't you import the oil at American and British prices? You're charging us too much. So Gierek gets economic concessions, and he takes over.
Okay.
And he's in charge from 1970 to 1980, another 10 years. And everything is quiet.
Yep.
At least in Poland, it's quiet, okay? So anyway, I think we have to talk about Pope Pius XII and John the 23rd.
Okay.
Pope Pius XII was an all-reactionary, pro-German, quasi-fascist pope who died in 1958. And the new pope is Pope John the 23rd. Most radical pope in 500 years.
Yep.
And he decides to call the Second Vatican council,
Right.
the Second Ecumenical Council, and they met for 4 years, from 1958 to 62. And Pope John the 23rd says, we have to make concessions to the Jews, and we apologize for all of the anti-Jewish sentiments we had throughout the medieval period. And there were lots of Catholics who believed, medieval Catholics, who didn't have much knowledge, and that the Jews somehow were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ.
Right.
There's some evidence for that, but there was also evidence that they didn't. But anyway, that's a debatable story. So anyway, Pope John says, we make an apology. Go back to 325. We apologize for any previous sins. And the present-day Jews are not responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. That was his apology to the Jewish community. Then he made a concession to the Eastern Orthodox Church. He said this demand of the Vatican that you have to lose, that also was a little bit erroneous. And the Russian language, the Serbian language, the Bulgarian language, you can use the vernacular. And you can use the vernacular in the United States. You can have an English mass. Yeah. You can have a French mass. Forget this Latin.
Yes.
So people in the United States were saying, what's happened to the Pope? Has he gone communist? Because then he makes an apology to the Soviet Union. We're no longer going to fight the Cold War. What we need is peace. We have to have negotiations on nuclear armament. So, wow, was that a change in heart?
I know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that helps John Kennedy get elected as a new liberal Catholic.
Well, it certainly didn't hurt.
It didn't hurt. And that pushes the Polish Revolution and autonomy and so forth and so on. And Pope John the 23rd then opens up the doors, and John Kennedy wins in 1960, the first Catholic to win the presidency. And the last time, and the first time that any Catholic tried it was Al Smith in 1928, and he got smashed because there was a anti-Catholic prejudice going back to Britain and the Reformation against papal intervention in American and British politics.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, John Kennedy goes down to Houston, Texas, and talks to the Protestants and said, well, look, I'm a man from Harvard. You're not going to hold this against me. And my major advisor is Ted Sorensen, who's a Unitarian. And I have all of these Harvard professors in my cabinet. So forget about the old days. So the Catholic vote is key now to Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, and Jimmy Carter, and Clinton, right to this day. And the Catholic vote is much more liberal than it used to be. And Jimmy Carter then had Zubrinsky, a Catholic Pole, in his cabinet. Or not a cabinet, no, he did. He was the national security advisor.
Right.
And he was elected president, and he needed the Catholic vote if he was going to be reelected. And of course, Ronald Reagan has anti-communism. So there were 2 or 3 different brands of anti-communism by this time. So that's the importance of the advance of Carter and Zubrinsky and So maybe we ought to make a second question here. Did Pope John Paul II, after John the 23rd dies, and there are a couple of other minor popes who are rather conservative, but Pope John Paul II, does he speed up the collapse of the Soviet bloc within by going to Poland and visiting Poland? Does he speed up this descent? Do you know anything about John Paul II? What does he do?
Well,
what does he do in relationship to the history of the papacy?
Well, he's the first non-Italian elected pope in 500 years.
Right.
after John Paul the 23rd died,
They had more Italian cardinals.
he was succeeded by Pope John Paul the First, who was only there less than a month before he died.
Well, it was Pope Paul the Sixth, right?
Oh yeah, Pope John Paul the Sixth, and then you're right.
No, Paul the Sixth, and then the next
Paul the
Pope
Sixth,
comes along. Are you going to be Paul or John? He says, "Well,
I'll be both, yeah.
I'll be John Paul the First."
Yeah,
because they didn't want to get into this liberal conservative.
Yeah, well, Paul the Sixth was more conservative, much more
than John was.
He was a much more traditional pope.
Yeah,
he was much more in the line of
no more change. We've had enough revolution.
Yeah, Vatican II was enough. Let's calm down for a while. So, well, anyway, John Paul II comes in. He's the first non-Italian in 500 years, and he's Polish.
Right.
He was the bishop in. I'm trying to think of the town. It wasn't Warsaw. Krakow.
Eastern Poland.
Yeah. He survived the Nazi occupation,
That's right.
which was an extremely difficult thing for a Pole to do.
That's right.
Not counting the Jews that were killed in Poland, Poland lost a third of its population during the war.
That's true.
Of Poles. So,
but he stayed out of the army.
Well, he's a priest.
Well, he goes to seminary school.
Yes. Yeah.
He's only in 1938.
Yeah.
He's only a teenager.
Right.
And he moves to Krakow in order to get into a prep school.
Yeah.
Saying, I want to prepare for the papacy.
Yeah.
I want to, not the papacy, but I just want to be a priest.
Right, right.
And he doesn't become a priest until 1946. But he's working in the working class in Krakow all during the war.
Right, right.
For both the Germans and the Soviets.
Yeah, he's
and just staying out of the politics.
Sure. Well, it's a good way to survive. Okay, get to your question. Did he speed up the Soviet withdrawal from Poland from 79 to 89? It's difficult to say, and the reason is don't forget the Soviet Union had other hot issues on their plate.
Right.
From the death of Stalin up to Gorbachev, the Russian army was declining as an occupying force in Poland. By the time Gorbachev finally says, okay, no more Soviet armies will be in Poland, it was down to less than a division.
Yeah.
There was so the withdrawal was gradual, but it had been continuous. What sped it up more than anything, in my opinion, was the war in Afghanistan. They needed the troops. They had to get. Okay, where do I go to get a standing army? Where's my standing army? Well, it's not in Russia. Yeah. It's in Eastern Europe under Warsaw Pact. Well, where's my largest concentration? Well, in Poland. Right. Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria.
That's an aspect. I
need to bring those out.
You're saying that the reputation of John Paul is exaggerated.
I think so.
And you think it's more the military.
I think when you look at it more strategic and
yeah, that's good.
Practical. I think you're going to find that there was other reasons why the Russians needed to get troops out of there. Did John Paul hasten the revival of Polish nationalism and help bring about the eventual collapse of Warsaw Pact?
Well, he has contact with Zabriskie.
Yeah,
I think that's important.
He did, but again, how much really can the Pope do? Okay, he can go to Poland, which he did several times, and have great mass rallies, and be on TV with the General Jaruzelski, and making him look like a total fool, stumbling for words, because he's very nervous to be in the presence of the Pope. But one thing everybody knew John Paul was not going to do. He was not ever going to issue, people of Poland, rise up. No. Throw off your oppressors, take up arms, and drive the Russians out.
No, he's not going to say
Everybody, that. Even Gorbachev, knew he would never, ever say that. Absolutely. Now, there were, I think, a lot of Polish nationals who would have loved to have heard those words. Maybe Lech Wałęsa might have been one of them, but no, he wasn't going to. In fact, if anything, I think Pope John Paul was probably more of a stabilizing influence and actually keeping the lid down. Basically saying, folks, change has come, it's here, it's inevitable. You don't have to take to the streets and burn the place down. The things are going to change on their own. So it's a little bit of both. I don't see how you could ever really qualify.
Well, he becomes a world traveler.
Yep.
And when Jimmy Carter was president, he visits Jimmy Carter in the White House. Mm-hmm. This is the importance of Zabriskie. Zabriskie visits and gets the Pope. So American-Polish relations and using this economic. And some people say, we don't have the evidence, that Zabriskie and the Reagan actually subsidized with money. There was a Vatican bank. Well, we haven't got the documents to that.
Right, right.
But there could be some indirect influence between the Carter administration, Zabriskie, the CIA.
Yeah. To the papacy? And then what's the papacy doing with the money?
Well, the papacy is just a symbolic religious organization.
Right. But they
talks morally to the Polish people.
Right.
But the Polish people, like the American people, have an economic side, a political side, and a religious side. So the speed up is quiet and secret. No harm.
So is this money funding solidarity?
We haven't got the solidarity.
Okay.
I was just talking about the early background.
Okay.
Now let's talk about during the occupation. The priest, whose name was Watinsky, what's his name, was John Carroll Watinsky. Votilia. Okay. He sticks his neck out for Jews in Krakow. And he saves a Jewish boy and a Jewish girl. And he's not the traditional anti-Semitic Pole from the medieval days. So he is able to go to Israel. And you're a righteous Jew. So he's got his diplomatic contacts. He visits Margaret Thatcher, he visits Ronald Reagan. So I think there's money behind the scene as well as political propaganda. That's all I'm suggesting. It's very subtle. But
well, I see your point.
It had some influence. I think it had some influence in speeding this up.
I'm not saying that it didn't. I'm not just saying that I don't think it was decisive.
Okay.
I think it was more or less inevitable.
Inevitable. Okay. Yeah. Well, okay. I think we ought to jump now to this solidarity thing. I think that's the third revolution, 1980.
And we're back to Gdansk again.
Yes, we are. It starts again in Gdansk. Okay, Gomulka steps down, Gierek steps down, and we come here to this next chapter here. 1980. There's a big strike in the shipyards again. Led by Lech Walesa. And this time you have massive resistance.
Yes.
1/3 of the Polish Communist Party joined Solidarity. The papacy joins.
Yeah.
See.
Everybody's jumping into it.
Yeah. So the Moscow knows you can't do anything about this. Now they're able to put this down very subtly by bringing in Jaruzelski. Jaruzelski is a Pole, and Brezhnev does pull a fast one. He appoints Jaruzelski as the Minister of Defense. And then Jaruzelski is promoted to the Polish prime ministership. And Jaruzelski says, I'm a military man. And he goes to Lech Walesa. He says, now you send your strikers back to work. And we're going to call this strike off, and you're going to gradually go home. And if you don't do it, I have to resign, and the next time we bring back an all-Stalinist Soviet general, and then we'll have 1968 in Slovakia, where we have a complete crush. So Lech Walesa and Jaruzelski are kind of negotiating to reform the so-called Polish Workers' Party.
Mm-hmm.
And Lech Walesa is demanding free elections.
Yeah.
Well, they get elections. They're not exactly free.
No.
But there are elections.
Right.
And I think we ought to talk about the gradual. Well, 1980 was the big year.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1981, 82, it's gradually petering out. That's the big strike is over.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives.
No, but what it did was it gave birth to Solidarity.
Solidarity was a Polish original movement.
Yes.
And the Soviets are able to block that for a couple
Right,
of
but it's
years.
still there. It's gone underground.
Right,
It's
it's
quiet.
gone underground.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
We got 2 minutes.
Okay,
2-minute
so
warning.
I think we'll end here in 1983. Lech Walesa was put in jail for about 2 years.
That's right, yeah.
And then he was released. And they say, okay, you're released, and we'll have a new united Polish party.
Right.
But there'll be no open dissent. So the solidarity, what the solidarity does is encourage the Germans and the Hungarians and the Russians.
Absolutely.
Because they're reading the news.
Yes.
That's how it does speed it up. It spreads.
Yeah.
Spreads all over
Yeah,
the
once
world.
the crack starts, it
Yeah.
starts
Well,
to
I
go.
think we'll have to stop at this
Okay.
decisive
Well,
point.
all righty.
And we'll have to continue this some other time.
You bet.
And we have to keep the debate going.
Uh-huh.
Would you like a couple of minutes to give your point of view?
No, I think we've done a good job here.
Okay. Well, oxygen again is
no, debate is the oxygen of
democracy. It's needed, and we have to keep the oxygen going.
Yep.
And keep breathing, because there are people in the United States who want to cut the debate down.
How true.